Have you ever wondered why some families successfully transfer wealth from one generation to the next, and why other families seem to squander their wealth, or it ends up not transferring to the next generation? They end up losing 10, 20, 30, sometimes even up to 40% of their wealth as a result of things such as estate duty, capital gains tax, executors fees, etc. And the big reason some families do it well is due to how they structure their assets, how they structure their estate planning, and the mechanisms they use in the structuring. And one of the key mechanisms is something called a trust. Now, I see a lot of clients that I come across because I get consulted from an investment planning perspective. And the one thing I see quite often is that a lot of people that should have a trust don't have a trust. And there are also a lot of people that should not have a trust based on their goals and objectives that actually end up having a trust. And in this video, I'm going to delve into the characteristics, some of the elements of trust, where I think it's appropriate to have it, where I think it's not appropriate to have it. I'm going to cover things such as tax, how do you get money into trust, what are some of the things to look out for. So this will be a technical deep dive on trust. Maybe not as technical, I'm not going to go super technical, but think of this as a broad overview of trust, the mechanisms behind it, and how it can benefit you, and whether, most importantly, whether it is the appropriate structure for you. Let's get into it. What are the types of trusts that are available? Now, the first thing you look at here is when is a trust formed, and there's two types of trusts. The first one is a testamentary trust, which is created as per your will, and it normally forms when you were to pass away. So they'll read the will, and the will say, if Tiaan passes away for his 64 kids, we are going to create the amazing Tiaan Trust. I would never put your name in the trust because that complicates things, but let's just, yeah. So the point is, it gets created as per the will when you normally pass away. The second type is called an inter vivos, or think of it as a living trust, commonly referred to, whereby I am still alive, the founder of the trust, and I create the trust while I'm still alive, and I don't have to wait until I pass away for that trust to be formed. Now, whether or not you have a inter vivos or living trust, or whether it's a testamentary trust, the types of trust as per what the trustees can usually do, there's normally two types. There is a discretionary trust and there is a vested trust. Now, what's the big difference between those two? In the discretionary trust, the trustees can apply their discretion. They can decide how and who receives capital or income and when they receive it. So they have the discretion. In a vested trust, the beneficiaries have a fixed right to the income or the capital, and the trustees have little or almost no discretion over the distributions. So that's a very clear articulation you need to make when forming your trust and the trust deed as to, is this a discretionary trust or is it a vested trust? The next question is, why have a trust in the first place? Now I'm going to tell you why and also why not. The main reason for me to have a trust is for the succession planning. Now first and foremost, a trust lives forever. Until you unwind the trust does not die like a natural person. So if you have a trust, your assets will forever live on long after you have given them to the trust or long after you have passed away. The trust also protects your assets from any outside forces. So you can be protected from creditors. You'll also be protected from, maybe you have a son or daughter, they marry somebody, you hate that person, they're just after your money. It's protected from that. It can also protect vulnerable beneficiaries, maybe people that don't know how to work with money. That's what I'm saying. It's for succession planning, asset protection, growing your wealth. And also maybe you want future growth to take part outside of your estate because a trust doesn't pay any estate duty tax, capital gains tax, and executors fees that arises on death. And just a reminder, if you pass away, you pay 20 to 25% estate duty unless the money goes to your spouse. You have a 3.5 million abatement, or up to 7 million if your spouse didn't use theirs. You pay 18% capital gains tax at the maximum rate. When you pass away, again, anything goes to your spouse, you don't pay, but on the second spouse, you will pay capital gains tax, and you also pay executors fees for the assets in your estate that the executor handles. So those are the reasons to have a trust. It's to make sure that you protect the family wealth from an estate planning perspective. What are the reasons not to have a trust? And for me, normally if you have a small estate, so this is a rule of thumb, it's not a recommendation, none of this stuff that I'm giving you is recommendations, but if you have a small estate that's less than 20 or 30 million odd, I'd say, I'm not really sure if it's worth having a trust. Now, again, maybe in future the estate will be quite large, then you might want to start a trust. Also, if the assets you are putting in the trust is needed for retirement planning, I wouldn't put it in the trust. In other words, it's there, it's going to maintain my income in retirement, it's going to make sure it looks after my needs. I probably wouldn't put it into the trust. And if you don't want ongoing admin, don't put money into a trust. You can't just put the money into a trust and then say, okay, tomorrow I go buy me a car, or I need this amount of money. That has to go through the trustees. If you don't like tax or admin, don't put your assets into a trust. And then also, if your only reason for putting the assets in the trust is to save on tax, such as income tax. So let's say I'm in the 45% tax bracket. I want to put the money into the trust because my 2 young kids, they don't pay any tax. So if I put my investment in the trust, then they can pay the capital gains and the interest tax. You can't do that. There's Section 7 attribution rules that prevents that. I'll get to that a little bit later. But if your only thing that you're using the trust for is to not pay tax, don't put the money in the tax, or not in the tax, don't put the money in the trust. And also SARS are looking very closely at trusts, and I'll get a little bit later to the attribution principles. But if you want to protect your assets, you want to make sure your assets grow outside of your estate, if you want to make sure there's future wealth passed on to beneficiaries, that's a good reason to have a trust. Probably the most important thing in a trust, if you are going to go that route, is the trust deed. Now, the trust deed sets out exactly what the powers are of the trustees. It sets out what the rights are of the beneficiaries, and it also sets out the distribution rules. If anything, or if at any point in time this trust is audited by SARS or external parties, the trust deed is the first thing they will look at. So the trust deed is extremely important. Many times we see clients, and the first thing we end up focusing on, and it ends up costing money, is redoing the trust deed because it wasn't draft fit for purpose for where the trust is. And if you look at it, sometimes you realize this is just basically a sham trust to not pay tax. The second thing you have to take into account, apart from the trust deed, is your trustees. Now, again here, you always want to make sure you have an independent trustee. It can't just be Tiaan and his partner, or Tiaan and his spouse, because that then doesn't really have any independent trustees, and then basically you retain the ownership of your assets. It's basically the 2 of you still retaining your assets. So always have an independent trustee. Also, make sure you always have an uneven number of trustees. If you have 4 and then 2 want to do X and 2 want to do Y, that doesn't go down well. Don't have too many trustees. And make sure that every single resolution in a trust is recorded. You have a record of it, specifically how the assets get into the trust. That's very important that the trustees, along with the accountant, do that, because that has implications from a tax perspective when you start distributing assets from the trust to the beneficiaries and you look at how it's actually taxed. Okay, so the trust deed and selecting the trustees are very important from that perspective. So how is a trust taxed? Now, this could be an entire video on its own, and I'm going to give you a couple of things on trust taxation, but this is probably the most technical part of trust, and it's a part that people don't always understand or fully understand the consequences of their actions when putting assets into a trust and the tax implications. But let's start with the beginning. An individual, Tiaan here from Tiaan Finance, I get taxed in my own name anywhere from 0% to 45%. Okay, so depending on the more income I earn, the higher I get taxed. I also get certain exemptions. I get exemptions for interest. If I'm below 65, it's 23,800. If I'm above 65, it's 34,500. I get exemptions for capital gains tax every year. And when I pass away, if I give assets to my spouse, I am exempted from capital gains tax and estate duty. So I get taxed at a sliding scale. I have exemptions, and for capital gains tax, my highest tax rate is 18%. That's the 40% inclusion times the 45% maximum marginal tax rate that I could apply is 18% for capital gains. A trust is completely different. A trust gets taxed at a flat rate of 45%, not 0, then we jump to 18, then we jump to, it's flat 45, papa. So what that means is any capital gains or income in the trust will be taxed for for income purposes at 45%. Capital gains differing to an individual, whereby individual has a 40% inclusion rate. The inclusion rate for trust is 80%. And then if you take the 80% inclusion, you times that by the trust's tax rate, you get to a 36% tax rate for capital gains. So understand one thing very clearly, trusts are not tax efficient at all. However, where do people utilize tax efficiencies within trust? When you look at the trust and you have beneficiaries, there is something called the conduit principle, whereby when a particular income or gain is vested in that particular beneficiary, and there are no Section 7 attribution rules that apply, or paragraph 68 to 72 of the Capital Gains Tax Act, I'll get to that in a second, then in those cases, you can say, okay, well, my child is now at the age of 25, and this capital gain, this part of the investment will vest in their name, and they will pay the capital gains tax. And because they are taxed at a lower rate, they will pay the capital gains tax, and it actually is quite beneficial. That is something called the conduit principle. But, and there is a very big but, for that to apply, there are first some other things that need to be checked. And these other things, in simple terms, are called attribution principles, which simply looks to see where did this asset in the trust come from? What was the nature of the transaction that led that asset to go into the trust? And as a result of the nature of that transaction, will we allow the conduit principle to take place or not? Now, let me give you an example of what that means. Let's say I have R1 million, I'm going to give it to the trust. And now remember, every year you can donate 150,000 to anybody, which is free of donations tax. But if I now gave it, let's say I've used my 150,000 for the year, I've given money to a friend or whatever that might be, and I'll put the R1 million into a trust. I'm immediately going to have to do one of three things. I can either pay donations tax of 20%, and then the 800,000 goes into the trust, or I don't pay any donations tax, and I create a loan for the amount the trust owes me, and then I charge them either no interest or very little interest, or the rate I should charge them. If I charge them interest below the official rate as determined by SARS, and the official rate is the repo rate plus 1%. At the time of recording this video, that rate is 8%. If I don't charge the trust that 8% interest, then the difference between the interest I should have charged them and the interest I am charging them also becomes a donation. So just keep that in mind when you put assets into a trust. It's not as simple as just putting it in there. There is a cost of putting money into a trust. And what you've got to do is weigh up whether the cost of doing that is worth the cost of the estate planning, the capital gains, etc. I might end up paying one day when I pass away in 30, 40 or 50 years time, or whether it's worthwhile paying that cost to make sure these assets are protected for my family for succession. Now, why did I give you all of that detail? The nature as to which the asset has gone into the trust. If it's purely a donation, Section 7 says that for income to be taxed in the hands of the beneficiaries via the conduit principle, the nature of that transaction is very important. So if I've simply just donated the money to the trust, then they might say, hold on, but there are certain deeming provisions, Section 7, called attribution rules, that say that the only reason, Tiaan, you've put that money into the trust is to make sure that your spouse, who has a lower tax rate than you, is going to benefit. So that will be taxed in your hands for as long as that asset is in the trust and for as long as you are alive. So that's why it's very important to make sure when you transfer the assets to the trust, you do it in the most optimal way so that you can potentially benefit from the conduit principle in future. So that's a very quick take on taxes within the trust and how it works. Now, it becomes very technical. I'm happy to go into more detail. You can ask me your questions in the comments, but that's a brief section on how taxes in a trust works. So what are the costs of setting up a trust? Now, this point here is where I'm going to show you some banks, some online places where you can have trusting services, where you can set up trusts, the administration of trusts. I'm going to insert here some clips of what people tend to ask to set up trusts, to manage trusts. Generally speaking, there's two ways in which they ask you, or whether you pay for trustee services. So there'll obviously be a setup for the trust. But anything you do in a trust, where there's a trustee involved, where it means there needs to be resolutions, minutes, is going to cost you money. So again, at this point in time in the video, I'm going to insert some screenshots to show you examples of what these services cost, just to give you an idea. but a trust is not cheap to administer. It can cost you anywhere from a percentage of the assets in the trust. I've seen in some cases sliding scales from zero point 0.5 to 0.25 fixed fees, but it's not inexpensive to own a trust. So be very clear as to whether it's worth paying the fee to have the money. The one asset I would also never put into a trust is your primary residence. Why? Because if you were to sell your primary residence, you get a primary residence exclusion of 3 million. You don't get that in a trust. So it also becomes very technical when you have multiple beneficiaries in the trust and you have a property and that is the only property in the trust. So your primary residence, I would never ever put into a trust. Also, if you are building up a property portfolio and you want to make sure this property portfolio is protected, I would never ever put that into a trust. I would rather put it into a company whereby the company is owned by the trust. Okay. Why? The company is taxed at 27%, not at 45%, such as the trust. That's one pitfall we see quite often, people just moving properties into a trust. You probably rather want to put it into a company whereby the ownership of the company is owned by the trust. So what are some of the pitfalls of trust? Now, the first one I've mentioned is it is costly. Okay, it's not cheap to own a trust. That's why I normally, just looking at asset base, I would normally recommend, and again, none of this is advice. If you want advice, go speak to a financial planner or go speak to a fiduciary specialist. But I would normally not look at a trust unless I have 20 to 30 million worth in assets, just because the costing of the trust structure can be quite expensive, and I've given examples of that. The second downfall of a trust, a lot of people don't realize is, great, you've got your trust set up, you're now going to make sure your wealth is protected for generations to come, but there is a big but. I recently sat with various clients, and we normally come across this quite a lot, where they say, the purpose of this trust is to build wealth for my beneficiaries that are no longer SA tax residents. And I go, oopsie. Just remember, a offshore trust cannot hold offshore investments directly offshore. So if I'm no longer an SA tax resident, there's no reason for me to be investing my money into SA. I want international investments, I want international exposure. The big pitfall of a South African trust is that you cannot hold direct offshore investments. It has to be done via asset swap. What that means is that when you set up the investment in the trust, that money is taken out of the country on your behalf by somebody else, but that money always has to pay back into South Africa. So if the reason why you have an offshore investment, that's a different video, is to protect against a risk in South Africa and to diversify directly outside of the country, a local South African trust actually does not help you do that, because the money always has to pay back into the trust in SA into a local SA bank account. That is a very important consideration. That's one of the big downfalls for me of trust, is that it cannot hold assets directly offshore. That is why for a lot of clients, I prefer things like international offshore wrappers, whereby it's simple from an estate planning perspective. The assets are directly outside of the country, doesn't have to pay back in SA. The other downfall about a trust is I do think for a lot of people, the administration and the cost together isn't worth it. And that simple life cover is a much better solution to help cover your estate duty, capital gains, tax bills, etc. But again, that doesn't circumvent your issue of protecting against outside parties. That's a different topic whatsoever. And then the other thing is about SA trust is that it is not as efficient as offshore trust in giving you exposure, like I've mentioned, outside of South Africa. Now, then you get to offshore trust. Now, the thing about offshore trust is different to SA trust is you, as the founder of the trust, cannot be a trustee on an offshore trust. You have to relinquish all control to external trustees. The other thing about offshore trusts is they are extremely expensive. You're talking about setup costs of 100 to 200,000. I've seen some even be more. And you're talking about ongoing costs every year of probably 150 to 250,000. So an offshore trust is extremely expensive. The other thing on an offshore trust is you normally can only receive any distributions from the trust in the form of a dividend, which is only taxed at 20% for dividends tax purposes, which again seems like it's low, but if I use an international structure in the life wrapped investment, which is a separate video, I only get taxed on capital gains and 12% on growth assets. So again, there are cases where an offshore trust makes sense, but you need to have a lot of assets to go into a offshore trust. And then the other thing is it's also very difficult. You have to look at how do you get the money into the offshore trust, because again, the same principles like donations tax, all of that will apply. So that to me are some of the downfalls of a trust. The administration is quite hectic. There are quite a few costs involved with having a trust. And then, like I mentioned, you can't really hold assets directly offshore. Hopefully this video has given you some insights to some of the basics of trusts, some of the maybe more technical details, but very importantly, it is of utmost importance that you go see a fiduciary professional to make sure, or maybe just to understand whether or not a trust is the appropriate structure for you, whether you need it. Please, please, please note this is not financial advice. I'm just trying to give you more insights to trusts, to some of the pitfalls I'm seeing with clients, some of the conversations I'm having. And if you want a consultation, maybe just a coffee chat to find out if a trust is an appropriate structure with me, comment the word trust in the comments. I'll reach out to you. My details is in this video. But yeah, I'm hoping that has given you some more insights into how South African trusts work and some of the pitfalls, some of the benefits, and whether or not a trust is the appropriate structure for you. Until next time, this is Tiaan's Finance. I hope you found this video insightful. Bye-bye.